We're now on Radio 4. The science of paedophilia is a comparatively new and controversial area of study, but recent research is starting to widen our understanding and has implications for the way we deal with those with the condition. Matthew Hill has been investigating the nature of paedophilia.
This emergency. My spot's been kidnapped. Okay, what's the name of the child that's gone missing? April Jones.
We are desperate for any news. April is only 5 years old. Please, please, help find her.
Within the last hour, we have arrested a 46-year-old male from the Machynlleth area who is being detained at Aberystwyth Police Station.
The news in October 2012 of the disappearance of 5-year-old April Jones and subsequent arrest of her murderer, 46-year-old paedophile Mark Bridger. 3 years on, April's parents, Paul and Coral, spoke to me about their tragedy. Given their loss, their views are perhaps surprising.
I'd like to see a lot more help offered out to paedophiles. So if they feel like they might have that problem arise, then there might be a way they can talk the way out of it.
If they come forward and say they've got a feeling to get treated, and then hopefully they don't offend, and like a couple of children are saved.
There should be something. It needs debate and it needs looking into.
We'll be doing just that in this programme when we examine the science behind paedophilia and how our understanding has implications for the best way to manage the condition. I'll also be considering if perhaps our collective revulsion is getting in the way of protecting children from sexual abuse. But first, what do we know about paedophilia? The short answer is very little. Even its very definition has been hotly debated in the medical community, but it's broadly agreed to be an attraction to prepubescent children, rarely affecting women. Not all paedophiles commit an offence, and contrary to popular belief, only a minority of child sex offenders are paedophiles and have a sexual interest in children. So how common is paedophilia? Well, there are very few studies and estimates vary. Dr. Sarah Good is a sociologist who's been researching adult sexual attraction to children since 2004.
The studies that have been done suggest that roughly 1 or 2 men in every 100 men will have a primary or exclusive sexual attraction to children. In other words, they would pass the clinical threshold for being a paedophile. But in addition to that, you're probably looking at possibly up to a fifth of all adult men who are capable of being sexually aroused to children under certain circumstances.
That's shockingly high.
It is. It is an extraordinary figure. 1 in every 5 men.
It was only when I saw a girl who was just under half my age that I realised that I was very much attracted to her.
How old was she?
She would have been about 5 or 6 at the most.
James, not his real name, just looked like your average 40-something and was extremely nervous when I interviewed him. He says he realised he was attracted to young girls when he was about 11.
And I liked her more than I realised until probably 3 or 4 years later when I was still thinking about her.
What's a sexual attraction?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, at first, I would say she was actually my sexual awakening. Up until that stage, I don't think I'd really had anything like that. It also started my lifelong cycle of depression because you can't explain it to anybody else.
You couldn't tell anyone at the time?
No, I don't think there's anybody you can tell.
The vast majority of research has been conducted on paedophiles in prison, but we know very little about those who haven't acted on their feelings. So Dr. Sarah Good carried out a study funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council which involved being in contact with more than 60 self-defined paedophiles. Her aim was to find out how men who are attracted to children manage to avoid acting on it.
What I found was that there is evidence for this group of extremely hidden paedophiles who understand that sexual contact with kids is wrong and who choose not to act on that. What I also found was that paedophiles are not all the same, and they range from people who are absolutely convinced, for example, that a baby can give consent to sexual activity, right up to people who would agree with the vast majority of people, I think, in this country, that any kind of sexual activity with a child under the age of 16 is wrong. And the other thing that's very interesting to note is the amount of paedophile presence, if you like, that's out there on the internet. So you've got a whole range of websites, the sort that you would expect, again, which are kind of devoted to exchanging illegal images. But also, and I think this hadn't been noticed before, that there are paedophile websites which support and encourage people not to offend and to stay law-abiding.
I absolutely struggle to believe that if there was a God, he would willingly do something that completely screws up your entire life. I can find no scientific explanation that satisfies me. I think you are just who you are.
So you're born with it?
I think so, yeah.
Out of interest, are you left or right-handed?
Left.
Well, that left-of-field question may sound bizarre, but it relates to one of the key findings of James Cantor, psychologist and sexual behaviour researcher from the University of Toronto in Canada. In 2000, he started collecting data on the characteristics of paedophiles, but first he needed to categorise his subjects by using what's known as phalometry. It's a delicate area. I'll let him explain.
We attach what's essentially a blood pressure cuff to a man's penis in laboratory conditions. We show them pictures of nude adults, nude children, and we measure to what people respond.
Dr. Cantor used this classification in combination with neuropsychological testing.
The biggest and one of the most important, it turned out, findings was that we found there was a much greater proportion of people who were left-handed. Now, the brain controls handedness completely. So when we started finding substantial increases, in the normal population it's somewhere between 8 and 10%, but among the pedophiles it was over 30%, which is, in scientific terms, absolutely enormous. Now, the only way to explain that would be as if there is some major difference in basic brain organization. We also found that physically they're slightly shorter than non-pedophiles, which again was some indication that there was something physiological that was different about these people, and it was something related to biology and probably linked to before birth.
If something goes wrong in the first few months of a developing fetus, such as maternal stress or poor nutrition, it can cause damage to the dominant hemisphere of the brain. Functions such as handedness are then transferred to the other half. On the basis of this work, Dr. Cantor was able to get funding to do the biggest and first study of its kind using MRI brain scans to compare 60 paedophiles with 60 controls.
We were not expecting to find what we found, which was that there was a large difference in the connective tissue of the brain, of the white matter of the brain. That was entirely unexpected. Really, nobody ever paid any attention to the white matter of the brain. It was seen as just basic connective tissue and had no function of its own.
White matter are neurons that connect brain cells and link various parts of the brain together.
Turns out that there is no single sex center in at least the human brain. Rather, there's a sex network. The part of the brain that processes human faces is involved. The parts of the brain that controls human motor behavior is involved. The parts of the brain that control hormones is involved. So in retrospect, this should have been obvious, but nobody guessed it until we actually saw it on the brain scans.
In lay terms, he describes this as a cross-wiring in the brain, which causes paedophiles to evoke a sexual instinct when they see a child. Dr. Cantor has also just published some new data on physiological differences.
There are a series of anomalies that we call minor physical anomalies. These are just minor malformations of the skin. People with attached earlobes is one example. Webbing between fingers or toes is another example. They're really very minor. Most people have at least 2 or 3 of them. But it turns out that there's a difference in how they're positioned among pedophiles.
Then what's the practical purpose of your research?
Well, if we can find whatever starts the chain of events that leads to this change in white matter or wherever else in the brain it turns out, then we might be able to prevent it from starting to begin with.
Mark, not his real name, and we've also disguised his voice, is a paedophile in his early 20s who says he's never acted upon his feelings and is primarily attracted to boys aged 7 to 13. He always had a fascination with children when he was growing up, but when he was about 16, things changed.
I noticed that I personally was experiencing something while interacting with them or while thinking about them, and not necessarily sexual, but just romantic, emotional. I cared deeply for them, I would relate and identify with them. That was the first and most primary thing, and it still is the most primary thing. But later on, I would say 18, 17, I also started to notice certain thoughts which were physical and sexual.
Did that trouble you?
Absolutely, yeah. That was the most disturbing thing. I didn't know what to make of it, so I didn't have any frame of reference. I just knew this concept of child abuse. I knew there were people who did things with children sexually, and I bent over backwards to try and disassociate myself from these people and say that this aspect of myself where there was physical, sexual thoughts, it's not me, and my moral salvation, so to speak, would be the fact that I could criticize myself for that I could hate myself for those thoughts. That's how I dealt with it.
Mark kept these feelings to himself, but did come out to a close family friend who suggested seeking help from a specialist clinic that deals with harmful sexual desires.
You hear this message that paedophiles are rotten to the core and that they are evil. And what I basically heard is that, okay, if society have the right to be so angry with me or so upset, then obviously there must be some sort of choice that I could make, which would be something that would take away these attractions. So I turned up to my first meeting. I broke down in tears. I was very emotional. I was like, okay, so what's the deal? And he was just like, well, there isn't really anything. And at that moment, I felt like my life had just, that was it, because I had built up this expectation that I could cure it. And then it was just all gone.
Next station, Hanover Nordstadt. Exit to the left in the direction of...
I've just boarded the S5 train at Hanover Station, heading towards the historic town of Hamelin. The tale of the Pied Piper has drawn tourists here to Germany for centuries. According to an eyewitness account, it was on the 26th of June 1284 when 130 children were taken from the town by a piper dressed in many colours. Whatever the truth of the story, it reflects our preoccupation with the fear of losing children to a stranger, especially a paedophile.
I'm in this particular part of Germany to meet some of the neuroscientists trying to understand the nature of paedophilia.
My name is Jonas Kner, and I'm a research associate of the NEMOP project.
A male volunteer is confined in a giant donut of an MRI scanner in Hanover Medical School. He's about to have some images taken of his brain for a study run by NEMOP, a consortium of 5 specialist sexual medicine centres which aim to look at the causes of paedophilia and why some offend and some don't. This government-funded large-scale study is the only one of its kind in the world and was started in 2012 after a series of child sex abuse cases in schools and churches.
So the key results are that the paedophiles had a slightly diminished intelligence, although it was still in the normal range.
Professor Tilman Kruger is a psychiatric consultant and principal investigator for the NEMOP project.
In contrast to maybe some assumptions, we did not find any alterations of empathy, so we don't have a higher rate of antisocial personality, and at least regarding this questionnaire, empathy is pretty normal in these people. The most prominent results are connected with offense status. We could even show that on the structural level, there are no differences between the pedophiles and the controls, but there are differences between the ones that had an offense already and that had no offense.
So that could ultimately be used as a predictive tool if you were assessing someone about their safety in society.
That's true, because we are very much interested in finding out new informations, helping us in our treatment also, and detecting people that have a high risk for offenses.
There is a special pattern of balls presented on the upper screen, which the subject has to copy on the screen below. And for this it's necessary.
Though it's very early days, the evidence seems to point towards a biological basis for paedophilia, and what the German and Canadian scientists are now sure of is that paedophilia is a sexual orientation, a permanent attraction that develops before birth.
Schon früh habe ich gemerkt, dass ich anders ticke. War schon klar, wie man über solche wie mich denkt. Krank, pervers.
A TV advert for the German initiative called Prevention Project Dunkelfeld. Dunkelfeld meaning dark field, and referring to paedophiles that aren't known about. The idea is to reach them before they offend. Klaus Bayer is Professor of Sexology and head of Charité, the Berlin institute which started the project.
The key message was that we will not condemn a person because of his sexual preference. And it would not be right to do this because nobody chooses their preference. And the other message was we can help you to control your behavior. And then you will not offend against children, and then you can be a part of the community, and this will help everybody.
Referred to as Don't Offend, the project is free and confidential.
What we have to do is to go to the community and to explain that social stigmatization of this group will not help, because then you force the isolation for them, and isolation will lead to a higher risk of offending.
Participants learn to cope and control their impulses using talking therapies, and medication can be used to lower their sex drive. Over 5,000 paedophiles have applied so far. The success of the programme has recently been evaluated.
The first thing is that we can influence risk factors. That's significant, and that the number of relapses are lower. This is what we could show significantly from our data.
But how much lower?
I would say a range between 5 to 20 cases lower.
Than the control group, you mean?
Yeah, right.
Right, so that's varying percentages there.
But let me say one thing.
Yep.
The problem is that it's very difficult to argue, because if you have a potential offender and he's coming to you and he would say to me, please help me, I don't want to offend, and I help him and he will not offend, because we have a large group of potential offenders who didn't offend eventually. But how to prove this?
Well, you are just relying upon their word for it, after all.
Yes, that's right.
Unlike in the UK, in Germany, therapists are prohibited by law from reporting offences that are disclosed to them.
We need to accept the huge amount of pedophilically inclined men, and this is not only a German problem.
But surely the safeguarding of children has to be paramount. If you're talking to a paedophile who says that they are inclined and about to commit an offence, then you have to report that.
No, in Germany we haven't. But the idea is, if a person like this comes to us, then we have the chance to help the people not to offend.
But what if you can't do that? I mean, surely you have to then get the state to intervene.
Yes, but the idea is, and it works, that only persons will come to us who would like not to offend. And this is the reason why they come. Of course, there are pedophilically inclined men who will not come, who will never come. And for them, there is only one solution. We have to find them and to capture them and to put them in prison.
Hello, Stop It Now helpline. Can I help you? Right, so you're having thoughts. Yes, of course. We will be making sure that you understand our confidentiality policy.
This is a typical response to the type of call that a free helpline in the UK called Stop It Now frequently receives. It started in 2002 and is run by the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, a charity dedicated to protecting children from sexual abuse. It's the only service of its kind in the UK, and there's currently no NHS treatment for non-offending paedophiles. Donald Findlater is its director.
The people that are likely to call us are those that may have offended and are troubled by their thoughts or behaviour towards children, or are men who are simply troubled by their thoughts, who haven't harmed a child yet, but are worried that they have the potential to. So they're struggling with their sexual interests and are trying not to act on it. So the helpline is there to accompany people, reassure them that we're there to support and listen, help them to manage their behaviour, give them encouragement that if they have been managing their behaviour towards children for a number or many years, that is something that they continue to do so that they don't represent an immediate risk, but also to offer them some hope about how life could be going forward.
There's been a massive increase in calls since it started, and demand is now so great, they say around 2,500 calls are missed each month. Because Stop It Now has a duty to report any offences disclosed to them, people generally stay anonymous, so most work is done over the phone, something Donald Findlater wants to change.
I think it's high time we had a debate, both a public debate, a political debate, but also a professional debate about how we can provide a confidential service, face-to-face service for men troubled by their sexual thoughts so that they can access good quality, effective treatment without being reported.
And what are the consequences for children from having your hands tied in this way?
Well, ultimately, one has to accept that if an individual is not assisted in a way that they need at the stage that they're troubled by their sexual thoughts, then some of those individuals may go on to do harm to children.
I did make the mistake of accessing images, level 1 images.
What's level 1?
Nude or clothed modelling shots, that sort of thing. But that's the only line that I've crossed, and I wouldn't cross it any further than that.
James lost his job and was named and shamed in his local papers. He received a suspended sentence, was put on the sex offenders register and had to go on a rehabilitation course.
You have to acknowledge that what you did wasn't just illegal but morally wrong, unacceptable within society, and that you are looking to change it. It's the last part that I think they completely screw up, because I don't think anybody can look to change it. You can't ask me to change it more than you can ask a homosexual man.
In terms of the support networks in this country, what do you think of them?
I think they're fairly well-intentioned but useless. I ended up ringing the Samaritans, who I felt so sorry for, because they're always fantastic, but that isn't their purview.
Were they able to help?
No, but at least they listened.
James says he's recently found support from other paedophiles online, but still feels in need of professional help. Mark has also found help online and is providing support to other young paedophiles.
You have these young people coming on talking about their thoughts and that they must be a bad person and they don't know what to do and they don't think they will tell anyone. A couple of them have tried suicide. I'm in contact with one or two which thankfully failed but attempted suicide.
Did you?
I did not attempt suicide. I thought about suicide. I didn't ever get to the level where I was planning it, but I would entertain the idea almost daily at a certain time.
But as well as providing support, the internet is also a very sinister presence. It's a huge problem. The police estimate 50,000 people in the UK regularly view indecent images of children. Although a strong indicator for paedophilia, less than half of online offenders will go on to abuse children. But given the numbers, how can the police cope? Simon Bailey, Chief Constable of Norfolk and National Policing Lead for Child Protection, says there will have to be an alternative strategy for lower-risk offenders.
When you are dealing with an offender who is absolutely at the low end of the scale, who is highly unlikely to then contact abuse, the capacity for the police service, when you look at all the challenges that we face, I believe there can be some form of other finding, be it within the criminal justice system, so there's a formal finding, so they become a registered sex offender. But then we ought to work with them to try and ensure that when they have those feelings, that they are then managed, that they don't then carry those feelings through into any other form of activity.
Some people would say the mere fact that they've been viewing this material in itself creates a demand. They therefore need to be punished.
And I understand that perspective, but if they are unlikely to contact abuse, and this is after a thorough assessment, and they don't pose the type of threat that a high-risk offender is going to present, then I think that we then have to look at options.
But I mean, if you are talking about some sort of counselling service for this category of people, are we talking about this being provided by the NHS?
I think there is absolutely a role for public health to tackle this, because it's just the scale of it. We are potentially talking about tens of thousands of people.
All agencies involved with the problem believe we need more research into paedophilia,
Dr. David Ho, consultant forensic psychiatrist and clinical research lead for the South Essex Partnership Trust, explains why he thinks there's been a lack of research in this area.
I think traditionally there hasn't been the appetite. It hasn't really been recognised as something which needs head-on tackling.
Is it because it's distasteful?
Well, possibly, but I would like to think that those in the medical profession deal with distasteful things on a daily basis. There might be an issue with funding in terms of research, national grants, private grants, and perhaps the funders find it distasteful as well.
Experts like Sarah Good and James Cantor say it's virtually impossible to get funding. So given that, Sarah Good thinks we need to look to ourselves to protect children.
I think that we have spent a long time misunderstanding what the problem is. And we have been, if you like, looking for those monsters over there in the corner. If we can identify them, then we can put them in prison or sterilise them or castrate them or whatever bad thing we think will prevent them from harming our children. All of that's completely wrong and a total waste of time. If we want to keep our children safe, we have to realise that all of us in society have to take responsibility, and every single one of us is going to know at least one man in our social network who is sexually attracted to children at some level. And when we understand that it's not them, it's us, when we really get that, then we can start to change our cultural view about keeping children safe so that we are talking to men with a sexual attraction to children before they have acted and harmed children.
This whole approach to preventing paedophiles from abusing may well involve not being afraid to ask some difficult questions, ones that may sit uneasily with the public. For many people who've been affected by the existence of paedophiles in society, the very nature of this research is uncomfortable, and its findings even more so. As a father of 3, I found it difficult at times. But if even the parents of April Jones are calling for a more proactive approach, then maybe the way we deal with men who are attracted to children will start to change, so we can help prevent this sort of situation.
Once I got told her bike was there, I knew something was seriously wrong. And then my mind just went to overdrive, contact the police, shouting at people, asking for help. And if I could have done anything that night to save her, I would have.
The Nature of Paedophilia was presented by Matthew Hill and produced by Helena Selby. It was a Whistledown production for BBC Radio 4. For details of organisations which offer advice and support, go to the Radio 4 Action Line website, or you could call to hear recorded information on 0800 044 044. That's 0800 044 044. The lines are open 24 hours and are free from a landline, but mobile operators will charge.